Van Halen wasn't just a band, it was a force that defined the sound of a generation. With Eddie Van Halen's innovative guitar riffs, David Lee Roth's over-the-top stage presence, Michael Anthony's thunderous bass lines, and Alex Van Halen's precise drumming, they created a dynamic that took the rock world by storm in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But behind the explosive energy of the music, tensions simmered, particularly between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. Their creative clashes and clashing egos grew to define the band's history, culminating in Roth's departure from Van Halen in 1985, a fallout that rocked the music world. Now, David Lee Roth looks back, reflecting on their partnership and the conflict that not only fueled some of rock's most legendary anthems, but also led to one of the most infamous splits in the industry. How does Roth view his time with Eddie and the band today? Let's find out. When Van Halen formed in the mid-1970s, it brought together a mix of musicians with very different strengths and personalities. Eddie Van Halen's technical brilliance on the guitar became the backbone of the group's sound, while Alex Van Halen's drumming gave the band its signature rhythm. Michael Anthony, often seen as the most grounded member, provided the steady bass lines and harmonized backing vocals. David Lee Roth, meanwhile, delivered energy and spectacle as the showman frontman. This combination catapulted the band to stardom with hits from their self-titled debut album, like Runnin' with the Devil, and Eddie's iconic Eruption guitar solo in 1978. Yet, even in those early days, cracks began to show in the band's dynamic. Eddie Van Halen had a methodical, precise approach to creating music, spending long hours perfecting riffs and experimenting with new techniques. Roth, on the other hand, leaned into theatrics and charisma, focusing on his larger-than-life persona and performance. This contrast in their creative priorities often led to friction. According to a 1982 interview with Eddie Van Halen, everything Dave brought was showmanship. It worked for a while, but sometimes it got in the way of the music we wanted to make. One of the earliest signs of tension came with the release of 1984, an album that saw the band moving in a more mainstream direction. Songs like Jump prominently featured keyboards, marking a departure from the heavier guitar-driven sound of earlier albums. While the song became a massive commercial success, topping charts and expanding Van Halen's audience, Roth reportedly disliked the shift. In a later interview, he said, "I felt like we were losing the core of what made us different. We were a hard rock band, not a synth band." Roth's frustration with the band's evolving direction coincided with personal ambitions that often clashed with Van Halen's collective identity. Throughout the early 1980s, Roth pursued side projects, including his solo EP Crazy from the Heat, which featured covers and a music video that leaned heavily into his theatrical style. While fans applauded the effort, some within the band reportedly saw it as a distraction. The growing divide wasn't limited to creative differences. Members of the band spoke of how ego played an increasingly central role in their disputes. Eddie Van Halen mentioned in a 2015 interview with Rolling Stone that there were too many cooks in the kitchen. Dave wanted to be in charge, but it didn't leave room for the band as a whole to work together. Similarly, Roth described the band dynamic as like being married to three other people with completely different personalities and no way to split up the responsibilities evenly. By 1985, the combination of creative disagreements, personal conflicts, and solo ambitions led to a breaking point. Though the band was still at the height of its commercial success, Roth's departure was inevitable. Alex Van Halen later commented on this period with Rolling Stone, "It wasn't just one thing. It was everything piling up. The arguments, the clashes, it couldn't go on." While Van Halen moved forward without Roth, his departure marked a turning point for the band and its fan base. But what ultimately led to the explosive fallout? By the time David Lee Roth left Van Halen in 1985, tensions within the band had reached their peak. While their public image projected success and unity, behind the scenes, the differences between Roth and Eddie Van Halen had become irreconcilable. Their relationship increasingly revolved around control over the band's creative direction, performances, and public image. One of the most significant disagreements stemmed from Roth's insistence on maintaining Van Halen's larger-than-life, party-centric persona. Eddie, however, wanted the band to evolve musically. This clash became evident during the production of 1984, when Eddie built a private home studio, 5150, to gain more control over the creative process. Roth reportedly felt excluded from this shift, which deepened the divide within the band. Eddie acknowledged this in a 2015 interview with Rolling Stone, stating, "The studio became my outlet because I felt like I couldn't have complete freedom in the band's creative space anymore. Dave wanted to keep it all on his terms." Roth's growing solo ambitions further fueled the friction. Recording and promoting his Crazy from the Heat EP while still a member of Van Halen sent a clear message to the rest of the band. Michael Anthony disclosed in a later interview that Roth's divided focus caused resentment. It felt like he was already halfway out the door, and he didn't care what happened to the band anymore. Despite these personal and creative clashes, the immediate trigger for Roth's exit involved direct confrontation. In multiple accounts, both Roth and Eddie described explosive arguments during the 1985 band meetings. Eddie claimed, "It stopped being about the music and started being about who had the loudest voice in the room." Dave's way of dealing with things wasn't constructive, he made it more personal. While Roth later downplayed the severity of these disputes, he admitted the working environment had become untenable, saying, "We weren't a band anymore. We were four people yelling at each other over who got the last word." The announcement of Roth's departure shocked fans, but didn't come as a surprise to those familiar with the tension between the band members. Initially, Roth cited his solo pursuits and other creative projects as the reason for leaving. However, years later, he acknowledged the deeper conflicts, stating, "It was never just about doing my own thing. It was about finding a way to be in control of my voice." That wasn't possible anymore in Van Halen. In the aftermath of Roth's exit, the remaining members of Van Halen moved quickly. Eddie Van Halen began working with Sammy Hagar to usher in the band's next phase. While Van Halen found continued commercial success with Hagar, fans were divided over the shift in style and personality. Roth's departure symbolized the end of an era for the band, and the lingering hostility between him and Eddie became one of rock's most infamous rivalries. The fallout extended beyond music. Interviews and public appearances often showed the bad blood between Roth and Eddie seeping into the media. While Roth openly mocked the band's new direction, Eddie dismissed Roth's antics as shallow and outdated. Their feud became a defining narrative for the following decades, overshadowing much of the band's ongoing success. Despite the bitterness of the split, the chemistry between Roth and Eddie remained undeniable. How did their shared legacy and creative tension shape the enduring story of Van Halen? Following his departure from Van Halen, David Lee Roth's relationship with Eddie Van Halen remained turbulent, marked by years of public feuds, indirect communication, and occasional collaborations that were fraught with tension. While both men expressed frustration over their past, they also acknowledged the necessity of their partnership in shaping Van Halen's success. Roth's solo career took off almost immediately after leaving the band. He released Eat 'Em and Smile in 1986, which had a harder, more guitar-driven rock sound, widely interpreted as a direct effort to compete with Van Halen's Sammy Hagar era. In interviews from the late 1980s, Roth downplayed his animosity towards Eddie but hinted at lingering resentment. "I had to leave because there was no room for two visions in the band. I wanted one thing, they wanted another." Eddie Van Halen, in contrast, rarely addressed Roth's departure on a personal level, choosing instead to focus on the band's success with Sammy Hagar. In a 1995 interview with Guitar World, Eddie remarked, "Dave leaving wasn't the end of Van Halen, it was the end of a chapter." We found a way to keep going, and that's what mattered. However, their professional separation didn't prevent occasional barbed comments in the press, with Roth once describing their tension as a disaster waiting to happen every time we worked together. Despite their rocky relationship, Roth and Eddie reunited several times over the years, though each collaboration came with its share of challenges. Their first reunion was in 1996, when Roth briefly returned to record 2 tracks for Van Halen's greatest hits album. The collaboration was short-lived, as conflicts reportedly flared during studio sessions. In one surprising move, Roth was let go almost immediately after the project's completion. Eddie later reflected on this reunion in his interview with Rolling Stone. "We thought it could work, but it quickly became clear that the old tensions were still there. It was like trying to light a fire with wet matches." More than a decade later, in 2007, Roth officially rejoined Van Halen for a highly anticipated reunion tour. While the lineup didn't include Michael Anthony, an absence that Roth admitted was a strange feeling, the band played to sold-out crowds across the country. Roth and Eddie's chemistry on stage was undeniable, but backstage, the decades-old friction reportedly lingered. Members of the touring crew later hinted in interviews that the two avoided extended interactions whenever possible. One crew member noted they were professional, but they weren't buddies. It was a business deal, not a reunion of friends. Even during their final collaborative years, the cracks in their relationship were evident. Eddie's declining health in the late 2010s brought some perspective, but even then, reconciliation wasn't perfect. Roth mirrored this sentiment when discussing their working relationship in 2019. "We were like 2 magnets, always attracted by the music we made and always repelled by everything else." Their final moments as collaborators came during Van Halen's last tour in 2015. By this point, Van Halen's active years were winding down, and Eddie's physical struggles made live performances increasingly rare. Roth would later describe this period as bittersweet, expressing regret that their chemistry as musicians couldn't translate into a stronger bond offstage. With Eddie Van Halen's passing in 2020, how has David Lee Roth's reflection on their history shifted, and what does it reveal about the legacy they leave behind? Eddie Van Halen's passing in 2020 brought an unexpected level of reflection from David Lee Roth, whose relationship with the guitarist had been strained for decades. While Roth had often addressed their differences in interviews over the years, Eddie's death marked a shift in tone as Roth began to speak more openly about their shared history and what Eddie meant to him and the music world. In one of his statements following Eddie's death, Roth acknowledged the complexity of their relationship but emphasized its importance in shaping his career. He stated, "I wouldn't be where I am without Eddie. We may not have always seen eye to eye, but the music we made together, that was something no one else could replicate." However, Roth also made it clear that their dynamic was rarely easy, reiterating that their personal differences often made collaboration challenging. The timing of Eddie's passing also carried significance, as it came during a period when Roth was preparing to retire from music altogether. In interviews around that time, Roth reflected on how the finality of Eddie's death forced him to reevaluate their shared legacy. He remarked that while they had never resolved many of their differences, he still viewed Eddie as an essential part of his own story. In a statement published in Billboard, Roth said, "We were adversaries, but we were also brothers. Not the hallmark kind of brothers, but the kind who can't help but clash while creating something bigger than themselves." Beyond Roth's personal reflections, Eddie's death reignited fan discussions about what could have been. Many speculated whether Roth and Eddie ever had the chance to fully reconcile their differences before Eddie's health began to decline. Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's son and bassist during Van Halen's later years, noted in an interview with Howard Stern that his father and Roth maintained a working relationship but stopped short of rekindling a personal bond. They respected each other professionally, but there was too much baggage to really repair things, Wolfgang said. The impact of Eddie's death also laid bare the limitations of the band's later reunions. While Van Halen's tours with Roth in 2007 and 2015 were commercially successful, they revealed lingering tensions over creative control. Eddie's declining health during the final years of the band further restricted opportunities for a proper musical reunion. Following Eddie's passing, fans expressed disappointment that unresolved conflicts had prevented the band from achieving its full potential in later years. A statement from former bassist Michael Anthony echoed this sentiment. There was always so much potential when those two were together, but it seemed like their issues never let them fully realize it again after the 80s. One of the most striking aspects of Roth's recent interviews has been his acknowledgement of what he views as unfinished business with Van Halen. While reflecting on Eddie's death, Roth admitted that he regretted not being able to rebuild a stronger professional relationship in their final years. However, Roth was also candid in saying that their dynamic didn't leave much room for compromise. He described their working relationship as a constant push and pull that created great music but left little room for repairing egos. Eddie's passing left Roth facing a reality that Van Halen, as the world knew it, was over. While Roth has occasionally hinted at a continuation of some sort, perhaps through a tribute project or solo material, he has admitted that the absence of Eddie's guitar makes any future endeavor feel incomplete. In the years following Eddie Van Halen's death, David Lee Roth has continued to reflect on Van Halen's legacy and the role their creative partnership played in shaping the band's place in rock history. While Roth has often been candid about the conflicts between him and Eddie, he has also expressed a pragmatic understanding of why those tensions existed. During a 2021 interview, Roth stated, "We were two very different people trying to create something extraordinary. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but you don't get the music without the chaos." One significant shift in Roth's narrative since Eddie's death has been his increasing focus on Van Halen as a collective. Despite a long history of framing his departure and the band's progression in terms of his personal challenges with Eddie, Roth has more recently acknowledged the contributions of Michael Anthony and Alex Van Halen in interviews. "It was never just about me and Ed," he explained in an interview from 2022. "Van Halen was a machine with many moving parts. Everyone brought something crucial to the table, and when it worked, it was magic." Roth has also been critical of how the band's fractured relationships affected its broader legacy. He has remarked on the missed opportunities that arose from internal politics, particularly how unresolved personal issues limited their ability to produce more music in later years. In a reflective moment during a 2021 interview, Roth commented, "We had the ability to keep producing great music, but we got in our own way. By the time we found moments of clarity, it was almost too late." Roth has also spoken about the complicated nature of honoring Van Halen's legacy now that Eddie is gone. Following Eddie's death, Roth has alluded to ideas for a tribute or celebration of the band's work, but these talks have seemingly stalled. While Alex Van Halen has reportedly been open to commemorating the band's history, logistical and interpersonal challenges appear to have prevented meaningful progress. Roth described the situation as delicate and difficult. In one interview, referencing the emotional weight of continuing a legacy without Eddie's presence. Roth's perspective has also focused on the personal losses felt by those closest to Eddie, particularly Wolfgang Van Halen. During a recent interview with Rolling Stone, Roth emphasized that while fans often talk about the creative impact of losing Eddie, the real tragedy was for his family. For all the riffs and solos, Eddie was still a son, a brother, and a father. That's the part that people sometimes overlook when they talk about his genius. As Roth continues to reconcile his feelings about his time in Van Halen, he has also hinted at how the band's story serves as both a lesson and a cautionary tale. He has noted how ego and creative differences can drive innovation, but also create irreparable rifts. For Roth, Van Halen's legacy is both a triumphant and bittersweet chapter in his career. Rather than focusing solely on the music, he has often used the band's story to reflect on human dynamics. In one of his final public comments about Eddie Van Halen, Roth remarked, "Van Halen was lightning in a bottle. You don't get to catch it twice, and maybe you're not supposed to. But we did something that mattered. even if it didn't always last. Roth's reflections highlight the duality of Van Halen's story, one of groundbreaking creativity and enduring music, tempered by personal discord and missed opportunities. As time moves on, the tensions that defined much of their history give way to a clearer understanding of both the brilliance and the challenges of their partnership.